she is eventually put on the most perilous routes of all as a courier, which is going right inside the heart of the Nazi Third Reich to Berlin itself with information. Fastest way to get it out to Europe, to London.
It's about Zoe, but it's also about Polish intelligence. It's about the Warsaw Uprising. But it is all refracted through the character of this absolutely extraordinary woman. Welcome to the History Book Buffs. I'm one half of the Buffs, Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and a critic. And in today's episode, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the show Clare Mulley. Clare is a renowned, award-winning author and historian, and we're here to talk about her most recent book, the Women's Prize shortlisted Agent Zoe, about the incredible wartime exploits of the Polish resistance hero. But we are also talking about the events of March 1945, 80 years ago on this day, when Stalin arrested 16 members of the Polish resistance against the Nazis and put them on trial. It's a fantastic conversation, and by the end of it, I let myself down a little bit by getting a bit more emotional than the fearless Agent Zoe would approve of. Don't forget, follow us, like, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and have a look at our YouTube channel and help us keep bringing you great chat about brilliant history books. And now I'm going to hand you over to me, talking to Clare Mulley about Agent Zoe. Welcome, Clare Mulley, to the History Book Buff.
Hello, lovely to be here with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, Clare, we wanted to get you on because Roger and I are both enormous fans of yours, but we're also both very fascinated by Polish history during the war and after. And this episode of the History Book Buffs is going out on the anniversary of the arrest of 16 members of the Polish leaders, in fact, of the Polish underground army. So we thought it was a really good time to get you on. We're going to talk about Agent Zoe, who is the subject of your brilliant book, shortlisted for the Women's Prize, held up there by Clare Mulley for our listeners. So we're going to talk about Agent Zoe, and we're going to talk about her wartime experiences, and then we're going to kind of come back and talk a little bit about the 16. But just before we kick off with Zoe, Clare, how significant do you think it was, that moment for the Poles when they watched the 16 most sort of totemic leaders of their resistance being arrested and then put on trial by the Soviets?
I am so pleased that you are framing this conversation in tribute to, but to remember this event, because it's so little talked about, particularly over here in the West. I think there is still, I give a lot of talks about Zoe, and Zoe was a Polish resistance fighter. And I have quite a few Poles in the audiences often, but a lot of the time I don't, which is great because, Zoe served in Britain. It's an allied story, shared history. But people often have no idea. One of my early slides, I show a map of Poland in 1939 and the Nazi German forces coming in from the west, but also arrows with the hammer and sickle and the Soviet forces, the Red Army, coming in from the east just 17 days later. And people don't know. People don't know that Poland was invaded twice at the start of the war, and that the Soviet Union started off actually with a secret protocol, meaning they were allied to Nazi Germany. And it was only in 1941, of course, Operation Barbarossa, that they changed sides and joined the Allies after Hitler invaded Soviet-held territory. So this whole post-war story, last year in Britain we were celebrating the 80th anniversary of VE Day and then VJ Day, peace and freedom, bunting and parades and people dancing the conga in Trafalgar Square, all of that. And of course in Poland, it's a completely different story. They have to choose, in a sense, between peace and freedom. And what they're left with is a Soviet-backed communist regime. And I think the most symbolic moment for them is the arrest of these 16 leaders of the resistance who had been allies of the Soviets during the war. And then so early on, they are arrested. They are actually offered safe passage. They're invited to come to a meeting to sort of manage the transition to post-war government. And all of them are arrested and they're beaten very brutally, and they're sent to Moscow for what is in effect a show trial. And I think 4 of them are pardoned, but the rest of them are all sentenced, and they don't return. And this is an appalling moment for Poland, although interestingly it's not pivotal in one sense, in that it didn't completely clarify the position. It doesn't bring a complete end to things. It does definitely hinder the ongoing resistance in Poland towards the Soviet-backed communist regime that's been imposed on them. But resistance does keep going, actually, right through the 50s, and the last arrest was made against them in 1963. But I think it is a very significant moment.
I think it's also difficult for the Poles, isn't it? That despite all the warm words of the British and Americans, when the bucks, when the music stops and there's this moment where Stalin moves against them, there's some diplomatic wrangling, but effectively the Allies don't do anything. And that's difficult as well.
Even at the trial, there are observers and there are journalists there from both Britain and the United States, and very little of it is covered. And I think this is partly because the Soviets are, of course, very canny, and the date of the trial coincides with the declaration of the new Polish People's Republic. And so there's a lot of competing news stories that day. And the Russians actually deny they've arrested these people, and then they say, oh, it's a minor thing and the sentences won't be great, it's just a process. And of course, over in the West, we are deeply war weary. We don't have economic resources to pursue anything in any military fashion anyhow. Churchill did look into it, and not specifically for this case, but in general, he understood, he was not sympathetic to the communists in any way. And he felt very closely the plight of the Polish people. And he did actually ask for an assessment to be made of the possibility of any kind of military way of giving, I think, what he called the Poles a square, fair deal.
Yeah, Operation Unthinkable.
Exactly. The very name of it tells us it was absolutely impossible. So the military people called it Operation Unthinkable, and they said there's absolutely no way that they can consider this. But it shows that Churchill was aware to some degree of the unfairness of this, but also has brought home very clearly that it was impossible to do anything. We didn't have the economic resources or the political will, and the Americans weren't anywhere near that. But in Poland, it was very hard. People like Zoe, actually, and others who had been to Britain, like Jan Nowak Jezierowski, I think they had a better idea of where Poland sat on the Allies' agenda and priorities. But for lots of people in Poland, there was this sense, partly because it's true, that Britain entered the war because they had pledged to do so for Poland's freedom should they be invaded. And Poland had served this hugely important role in many different arenas of the war. So militarily, I served at Monte Cassino and Tobruk and elsewhere. The two squadrons in the Battle of Britain that got the greatest number of hits, so kills, were the two Polish squadrons, with some Czech pilots in there as well. And then he joined the battle halfway through. The intelligence war, the contribution that Poland made was absolutely massive. The first Enigma codebreakers were the mathematicians Marian Rejewski and his team that came out through Lviv, passage out of occupied territory that Zoe was actually helping to keep open. And she knew Rejewski. They studied maths together before the war. So, and other information that was brought out from, obviously Poland was the first occupied nation, so the amount of information they could get out was hugely significant. So they played this very massive role, and then they are really left high and dry at the end of the war. I don't think there is, I think, considerable sense of betrayal still inside Poland. I don't think there is that much that Britain could have done. Even at the last conferences, the big three, in some ways it's really the big two. Churchill doesn't have as much authority as Roosevelt at this point, didn't have the resources behind it. And Stalin is hugely important at that point. So I'm not sure what else could have been done. And Britain does do something. So first Mass Immigration Act was the Polish Resettlement Act that enabled so many of the Polish soldiers to remain in Britain after the war, 250,000. So there are certain things that are done, but obviously for the people living inside the communist states, they don't have their freedom. And actually it's worse than that, because there are, I'm sure we'll come on to this, a lot of violent repercussions as well.
Absolutely. It's such an incredibly fascinating and overlooked thing. And I think partly maybe it's overlooked because there's a sort of sense of slight sort of shame from the British perspective, that we didn't or couldn't do more. So I've done quite a lot of in the book I've got coming out about the Cambridge Five, there's quite a lot in there about how they're mucking about behind the scenes as well. So Guy Burgess betrays Operation Thinkable to the Soviets, and Operation Thinkable effectively says we could not win a war over Poland. So Stalin knows that Churchill has commissioned a project to see if they could go to war with him over Poland, and concluded there's no way. And Stalin knows that. He can push and he can prod, and he's getting information from Donald Maclean. So it's a kind of awful and torturous. It's like watching a sort of slow boiling frog for Churchill, I think. But as you say, it's difficult to know what could have been done. Now, Claire, one of the reasons I completely loved Agent Zoe is it does that thing which I love in history books of telling a very wide story through a very narrow lens, right? So it's about Zoe, but it's also about Polish intelligence. It's about the Warsaw Uprising. It's about this period we've just briefly been talking about. But it is all refracted through the character of this absolutely extraordinary woman. So let's talk about Zoe for a bit. Tell us who she is, where she comes from, and how she finds herself at the beginning of the war, where she finds herself.
Right. Well, Zoe has got this whole stream of firsts and onlys. She's absolutely an incredible woman. She was, I mean, in a nutshell, she is the only woman to parachute from Britain into Nazi German occupied Poland. Because she is the only female member of the Polish elite special forces, the Cichociemni, which means the silent unseen, who actually trained out that window. If you go sort of down there a mile and a half, you get to Audley End House, which was the main training base, Special Training Station 43 during the war, where the Poles trained in Britain. And she very effectively took part in the Warsaw Uprising, and eventually she was responsible for helping to save the lives of thousands of people. And she kept on fighting. But she's also one of the very first women to serve in the war at all. So she was shaken awake at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of September 1939 by the force of an explosion. She was staying on a Polish airbase, and she thought perhaps this was the Polish Air Force undertaking exercises. She hadn't seen the memo. But then there was a series of further detonations, so she leapt out of bed and flipped on the radio. And there was an emergency announcement letting the Polish people know that they were under attack. We would now call it the Blitzkrieg, the start of that lightning raid into Poland at the very start of the Second World War. And the last thing she heard on that radio was their announcement. They said, "As of now, we are all soldiers," which she took deeply to heart. And in fact, she then pulled on her uniform because before the war, she was a senior trainer in the Women's Military Auxiliary in Poland. So in Poland, you couldn't be a woman in the armed forces and bear arms. You could serve in the armed forces. They had a huge, actually, women's auxiliaries, equivalent to our WAF and our all the rest of them. But they couldn't bear arms. And it's exactly the same in Britain. So they were in admin, secretarial, translation roles, things like that. Drivers, mechanics. And it was the same in Britain, which is why we had the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, commonly known as the FANY. I do love that acronym, because they sat outside the official structures, but they were very highly trained, disciplined, uniformed, could bear arms as well. So women who served as our female special agents were usually put into the FANYs so that they could carry weapons. And the equivalent was this Women's Military Auxiliary that Zoe was a senior instructor in before the war. So she had orders to undertake in the eventuality of an invasion and immediately stepped into action, trying to close certain routes to the invading army and so on, and was sent to Lvov, now Lviv in Ukraine, of course, then Lvov in eastern Poland. And she got there and started supplying weaponry to the anti-aircraft groups, making trenches and so on. And then on the 17th of September, they were invaded from the east by the Red Army. And Zoe starts working in a bomb-making factory in the basement of a girls' school, making petrol bombs. And because these are some of the most effective homemade weapons to throw against the enemy. And they help to defend the city, to keep that route open, because Poland knew they couldn't continue to fight on effectively on two fronts at the same time. So they never capitulated, but they took the decision to bring their armed forces, 350,000 troops at that point, out south through Lviv into Romania, and then they regrouped in France. And of course, they served in France, served again, all over. And so Zoe is keeping that route open. And she could have gone with them, holding her head high, and served in perhaps as a driver or something. She knew how to drive a military vehicle. She had great fun later driving a tank for a short while. But she decided the best way she could serve her nation was to remain inside the occupied home country and help to set up the fledgling Polish resistance. She set up a military intelligence network, recruited 200 people within a month, all of them women, actually, for specific reasons. They tended to be overlooked, underestimated, and then put her hand up to be the courier, taking the information from her region, which is Silesia, about the size of Wales, but strategically more important at that point in the war because it's on the border with Germany. Wales is great too. And she then volunteered to be the courier smuggling that information back to the resistance headquarters in Warsaw. A role she undertook and became one of their most experienced couriers. I won't do all the stories, but she is a hair's breadth from being caught by the Germans on numerous occasions.
It's amazing, breathless stuff. I mean, her bravery in the periods where she's a courier. I mean, I strongly urge people who haven't read Agent Zoe to buy the book just for that alone. I mean, it's amazing. But tell me about like how, I know you had access to a reason, like quite a lot of kind of her own words in various forms.
Yeah.
How did you, like, who was she? Like, what kind of sense do you get of what kind of woman she was? Like, how close do you feel that you got to her?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get all airy-fairy and, I don't like to think I have... I mean, she's dead. I never met the woman. So... And also, I think it's important that biographers or historians don't fall in love with their subjects, but retain a bit of objectivity. I think it's important to be critical as well as, recognise their strengths. Because I think also, even from a reading point of view, I think it's good to know someone, warts and all. And I think it helps us remind that they are extraordinary people, but they are also people like us, But I did get this massively strong sense of her character. She was incredibly determined. I think that's really her key attribute. I mean, she's a deep Polish patriot. She is a feminist. She said she didn't like the word, but she said, I am, because we have to fight for women's rights to defend and serve our country as well as everything else. She was very ingenious, quick thinker, great under pressure, resilient. She's also very lucky, of course. You can have all of the great skills and attributes and still be unlucky. And so it's never entirely within people's own control. And so she had some of that as well, but also great sorrows and griefs that she had to surmount. I think it's important when you look at her character to look back to her childhood. And in fact, even further than that, you have to remember that Poland has this extraordinary history, that centuries of being invaded by its very aggressive neighbours, it's annexed off into like Prussian Empire, Austrian-Hungarian Empire and so on. But also centuries of defiance and resistance and this patriotism that is passed down between the generations. So that helped to inform her character. She used to say that she sucked in patriotism with her mother's milk. I love that quite female analogy. But when she was born in 1909, she was born in a town, a very beautiful historic town that I spent a lot of time in now, called Toruń in northwestern Poland. And when she was born in 1909, that part of Poland was annexed into the Prussian Empire, so an earlier German empire. And the Prussians were very keen to suppress the Polish heritage and language, culture. So they were forced to speak German. I mean, this is one of many ironies in her stories. When she was born, she's legally actually German, not Polish at all. But her parents make damn sure she knows she is Polish inside her heritage. But her first language is German. And even, when she's in public, her name is Elżbieta, which is Elizabeth, the Polish version of Elizabeth. But when she's in public, she's Liesel or Lisa, the German forms of Elizabeth. So from knee high, she's been taught to have a double identity. What they don't seem to realise is they're training up the perfect person to serve against them in the war. She's going to be caught out on a German custom or tradition. She speaks fluent German. Coincidentally, she's blonde and blue-eyed. Obviously, not all Germans are, but it didn't harm her to fit that stereotype. So she is eventually put on the most perilous routes of all as a courier, which is going right inside the heart of the Nazi Third Reich to Berlin itself with information. Fastest way to get it out to Europe, to London.
She's an absolutely extraordinary woman. So in my reading about Polish women, I think one of the interesting things is how in this period, they have a very strong kind of sense of gender lanes. Women are women, men are men. It's not a proto-feminist society by any means. And yet they also, as you point out in your book, 40,000 women are members of the Polish Home Army. I think did you say it's like a tenth of the entire Home Army is women in this incredibly dangerous existential period for Poland's existence, and a tenth of the people taking up arms are women in this quite otherwise, conservative society.
It is a very conservative society, but it's very interesting. It's just think you have to be careful when you apply terms that we have an idea of what they mean over here that means something slightly different elsewhere. So in Poland, in many ways, it's a deeply conservative society. It's very Catholic. Obviously, at the start of the war, they had a very significant Polish Jewish population that sadly it was very different demographic after the war. But they're also very different to us in other ways. So when Poland was restored to the map of Europe at the end of the First World War in 1918, they did a constitution of rights for all. So they were one of the first countries to promote women's rights. So they're one of the first countries in Europe that women could vote. They're also very good at promoting gay rights. Extraordinary. That early period. So very advanced in other ways. And all of this does inform the female character. And women had also played significant roles in previous wars. Not officially. Many of them had dressed in male clothes to serve, and that's part of the sort of mythology of Poland. But in the 1863 uprising, for example, so many women served. It's sometimes known as the Women's War. And so there is this history, this cultural precedent for women to pick up arms. That doesn't mean they weren't frowned upon by many in society. They were. But there are all of these different strands that come together to inform the character of people like Zoe.
And while Zoe is fighting, I mean, she sort of encounters two types of male compadres, doesn't she? Like, some of her peers just are completely sportive, don't consider her any different to any of the other soldiers. And there are others who just can't get over the stumbling block of her femaleness.
Yes, that's absolutely right. This is another irony. One of the things that made the women so effective, particularly in an intelligence gathering role, but also in sabotage, in fact, and in assassination squads that they had for all of them, is that they tend to be overlooked because of the sexism. That particularly the very sexist German society didn't think at the start of the war that women had the nous, the courage, or the intellect, really, to undertake significant roles in this way. So the women that she was recruiting were working as secretaries or translators or just clean in the occupying German authorities' offices inside Poland, and overseeing everything and not actually dumb, remembering the conversations, the maps on the wall, the changing pins, the memos on the tables. But of course, when the Germans found out what these attractive young women with their lipstick and fancy hair were doing, or the old lady sitting on the tram with the heavy shoes that might be stuffed with something or whatever, their response was invariably very brutal. So the women faced the same existential threat as the men. But they also did come from a pretty sexist society and British society at the same time also, because this is the 90s. And so it's great when you can use that myopia of the enemy and exploit it. But when it's your own side who are preventing women from realising their full potential in the service of the war effort, that's really problematic. And Zoe faced an awful lot of that. I mean, some of it I found, not for her, but for me, quite hilarious. Some of them, these gentlemen start flirting with her, trying to soften her up, give her silk stockings. Other ones take a very different approach. She's called a feminist dictator and a captain in a skirt, all this sort of thing, which is very difficult. And one of her key missions she's given. So in 1943, she actually becomes it's the only woman I've found, I mean, there may be others, to be appointed as an emissary of the commander of an Allied army. So she's made the emissary, the personal representative of the commander-in-chief of the Home Army, which is the resistance army. And she's sent with 2 microfilms from Warsaw to London, which is one of my favourite chapters in the book's action all the way, because she has to cross over 1,000 miles of enemy-occupied territory, or just about. She's bombed, she's thrown out of hotel windows, she's shot at. She gets the worst, but she makes it. And she reaches London, and she has 2 missions to undertake in her commander's name. One of which is to sort out the courier routes. There's lots of problems, which I won't go into now, but she sorts that out. And the other one is to secure the legal status of women as soldiers in the Home Army. And unfortunately, by the time she arrives in Liverpool, her commander has been betrayed and arrested and will eventually be executed. And the Poles in Britain just don't believe that they actually want women. They have lots of women in the Polish armed forces, but not in combat roles. Although even those women, many of the women who served as drivers, I've interviewed women who served as drivers at Tobruk, bringing trucks of armaments up to the front line, who, of course, were in the line of fire and were shot at. But officially, they're not meant to be armed. And they cannot believe that women are meant to have this status. And I think part of it is because they're in Britain. And a lot of the men she is trying to persuade, they'd fought in the open fight, but they'd never experienced the clandestine war. Had to serve in the resistance, and they had no idea. I mean, a lot of them are based in France before France was overrun, and then get to Britain. And when we talk in Britain about the front line, we always think of it as a juxtaposition against the home front, where the women may be very stalwartly working in factories, maybe going up to Bletchley, in various important roles. But the home front is very different. In Poland, the home front is the front line. If you are serving as a woman, you are in the front line. It's a very different experience. So Zoe has to re-educate these guys as to what the battle is really like, the clandestine war is like. And eventually she does secure the legal right of women in the Home Army to be soldiers, which means they can be paid, so they can recruit more women, they can discipline the men if they're more experienced than them, there's less issues with security. And above all, of course, it means that they are party to the protections of the Geneva Convention, like prisoner of war camps. Previously, when women were caught, especially in the resistance, they're not serving in uniform. If they're caught, they're just shot or they're tortured. And then sent to be laboured to death in a camp, perhaps. But now they have the same protections for the first time in the war, the only time in history at the end of the Warsaw Uprising, because of this decree, which Zoe herself had written. The Germans set up prisoner of war camps for serving women. And there were so many, 12,000 alone in the Warsaw Uprising, that they had to set up 2 prisoner of war camps to contain them.
That is amazing. And Zoe's kind of fight for that I found really inspiring when I read the book, because in one sense, you know, you'd think she maybe had sort of other things to worry about, more about her own personal security or whatever, but this was so important to her. But I would love to let's talk about the Warsaw Rising, because it's the kind of climax of resistance.
Yeah.
And also, so we'll talk about Zoe's role in it, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting, you say in your book, I'm going to quote you to yourself.
Oh my God.
You say that in the beginning of the Warsaw Rising, she says, in some ways, these first days of the battle were the most wonderful time of my life, so told a friend. Having absolute faith in Polish victory, she felt that the return to open fighting was washing away the shameful stain of years of occupation. I loved that image. It really gave me a sense of who she was. You know, she does love actually being like a combatant. She obviously finds it exciting, although she's a bit frustrated where she starts out in the Warsaw Rising. But like, I think that gives you a sense of her. The Rising itself, I think, is one of the most extraordinary stories, both in your book and in the history of the war. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I should say, Roger, your co-host, and I and Alina Nowobilska did a 65-episode podcast on the Warsaw Uprising to mark its 80th anniversary last year.
Day by day, it was amazing.
Yes. If they're interested, I would suggest dipping into that. It's up everywhere. But yes, it's also the culmination, really, of Zoe's work in the Second World War. So, and it brings all the characters together that I look at in the book. They serve in that. So it's. I'm going to poach a line from Roger. He says, and it's absolutely right, the Warsaw Uprising, militarily, it was a fight against the incredibly brutal Nazi German occupation of Poland. The Poles had to hold back for so long to wait for the right moment. And the Warsaw Uprising was incredibly well organised. It launched on the 1st of August 1944, because by then we'd had D-Day, we've got Allied forces back in continental Europe, pushing back towards Germany, of course. And so, and anyone sane, really, I would say at that point, with any amount of information, would know that Germany was now on the back foot, and that the forces that had been in Poland very proud before are now pretty run down. They were retreating from the Eastern Front as well, very wounded soldiers coming through, alcoholism on the rise, all of that sort of thing, and fairly depressed. So they wait until this point where they feel that they will have the military advantage, and they think it will take them 2 days, but they have stocks stockpiled to last them for 2 weeks, just in case. And they know they're going to get some air support coming in from the West as well. But politically, this is also a fight against the Soviets, because, as I said, the Soviet Union had invaded Poland on the 17th of September. They'd only changed sides in the battle after Hitler had betrayed Stalin and invaded Soviet-held territory in Europe. And then they had changed sides and joined the Allies. But Poland knows damn well that they are a very aggressive neighbour with interests on Polish territory. And they want this sphere of influence across the whole of Poland. And so they're very keen, as the Eastern Front pushes towards Poland, they're very keen to be able to welcome the Red Army to their own self-liberated capital city, representing their nation as equals and allies, and not be beholden to them for their liberation. So this is the twin aims of this uprising. And it's deeply tragic. It's also deeply inspiring. And so they step into action. And Zoe is proud because this is her nation taking back control, seizing the narrative in the war, and bringing the fight out into the open. And amazingly, I've seen her own armband. So they made these red and white, or white and red, I should say, the colours of Poland, armbands with a little stamp on them. And this was their uniform. So they were fighting in uniform out in the open. And her uniform survives. There's actually some blood stains on it. It's quite a powerful thing.
That's goosebumps, Claire.
is. It's quite extraordinary. And so, yeah, she actually pulled it on. She pulled hers on an hour early because she was inside a building and she had been given this role. She was frustrated, as you say, she wanted to fight with a gun, but they started off by giving her a role as a sort of quartermaster role, providing supplies to the fighting front line and across the city, because she knew better than anyone her way around Warsaw because of her work as a courier. So she knew all the back routes and so on. And so she is in a building with loads of medical supplies, and she goes up to the first floor and looks down over the streets for the last hour of occupation, knowing this pivotal moment is about to take place. And she sees a small squad of men running to their starting point. And unfortunately, one of them has jumped the gun and has got his gun out literally early. And as they reach the corner to turn the street, there's gunfire and these men are shot. And she's horrified. So she runs down. She's got medical supplies. And she grabs a stretcher and starts making her way out when a medical team came in, two nuns and two civilian women, and their red and white armbands have got a red cross on them. And there's a bit of a tussle, really. It takes her a moment to realise there's greater need now than her need to serve. And then, of course, these are the women for that job. So they go out. She goes back to the window and looks down to watch. And as these four medical women go out, there's now more gunfire and all four women fall to the ground. And that is the hour before the uprising begins. It's just an indication of the brutality of what is to come in this appalling. And there are the key things to say. I mean, the air support was incredibly courageous air crew flying in. They're British, South African, there's American, there's New Zealanders. A lot of Polish pilots, of course, as well. And the attrition rate was so terrible. I mean, they're flying low so they can deliver these containers without smashing everything up. So they're going straight into the teeth of machine gun fire. And Stalin, when he reaches the outskirts of Warsaw on the east, they set up camp on the outskirts. They don't come in to the support of their allies. There's lots of reasons. It's easy to simplify it. Stalin had various other priorities at the time, but also it certainly didn't help his long-term interests to support a strong Polish resistance. Better for him to let the Germans take some of them out and vice versa. So they just sit there encamped, and the Poles can see them from the top of the last remaining tall buildings. They can see them there, just sitting there. And Radio Moscow has said, if you don't rise up, you're cowards and you're traitors, and then completely betrays them by not coming to their aid. And worse than that, Stalin says he refuses to give permission for the Allied aircraft coming in to supply to land on the airfields that he has taken to refuel. So they have to bring twice as much fuel in. So they're basically flying petrol cans and half as much supplies. It's just appalling. And eventually the Poles are forced to fight on, and they fight for an incredibly valiant 2 months, just over 2 months. And then they are forced to capitulate. And then there's no military advantage to the Germans. They're doing it because Hitler is so angry. He's partly angry because they start on the 1st of August, and on the 20th of July is the main attack on Hitler, and he's angry anyhow. But also he's insulted that the Slavic people, the Polish people, who he considers lesser than his Aryan in his appalling, criminally racist categories, would have the gumption to rise up against them. So he demands that they're all killed. He says, kill the soldiers and kill the civilians. Kill the men, kill the women, kill the children. And that's exactly what happens in a couple of Warsaw's boroughs. And then they flatten what's left after they've managed to defeat the Poles. They flatten the rest of the city and come in with flamethrowers, and then they immediately pull back. They can't hold it. And then the Soviets walk in. And then the Soviets claim to have liberated it. I mean, the whole thing is sickening.
It's horrible. And I mean, when you go to Warsaw in the Rising Museum and you see the pictures and the reconstructions of the devastation and the complete flattening of the city, it's absolutely heartbreaking.
It is.
The agony, that sort of sense of revenge being wreaked upon the Poles who've already had an absolutely horrific 5 years. The revenge wreaked by the Nazis, but then their agony is just not even over, and Zoe's agony is not even over. And everybody wants peace, but for the Poles, it comes at such a price. And you say one of your characters talks about it and says, apart from anything else, it's impossible for the Poles to forgive the Soviets for invading them in 1939 when they were already being invaded by the Germans, and then for the betrayal of the Warsaw Rising.
Yeah.
So even if they had been minded to be kind of open to being Stalinist sort of stooges. You know, they had such immediate and obvious examples of Soviet betrayal right there in front of them. And yet they've got no help coming from their allies. Warsaw is flattened. They're exhausted. They've got a government in exile half a world away. You know, for the Poles, it's just an agonizing period, isn't it?
It's just horrific, yes. One of Zoe's best mates is called Emilia Melessa, and she talks of, I gave it as a chapter title, A Soldier's Internal Conflict, because the way she puts it, she has to put it very subtly, she writes to the communist president, Beirut, who's put in charge of Poland at this point. And she says, you know, we have two governments, because they've still got the wartime authority, the Polish government in exile that got out through Lvov, went to Angers in France, and then after the fall of France goes to London. They're still operating in London. And they are the government that represents fighting Poland, that the resistance pledged their allegiance to. But now they also have this imposed communist regime. And she says, you know, it's to gain faith in that communist authority is going to be a very long, complicated and difficult process. I mean, what she means is it's impossible. You know, how can they? But she can't say that because she'll be shot. And that is exactly what's happening. So they have this awful dilemma, Zoe and Amelia and all of those fighters. Do they continue to resist now against the communist regime? They still don't have their freedom. That's what they've been fighting for, freedom, for a democratically free country. So do they continue to resist? Or do they recognize that fight at the moment, they're not going to get the support of America or Britain? They haven't got the resources themselves. We don't have the resources. They definitely don't. So should they focus their energies on the reconstruction of their nation? You know, you've got 6 years of people without education here. And Zoe is torn between the two. She does initially do some work with the ongoing resistance, and then she's been to London, of course. She realises that whereas many Poles still hold out hope for a World War III or a hot war rather than a Cold War, or she knows that's not going to happen. So eventually she plunges into helping with the reconstruction of her country, and she becomes an educator. She actually sets up the equivalent of the Open University in Poland, so long distance learning to reach people and so on. She does brilliant work. But that is their dilemma. Is it peace or freedom? You can't have both. Is it reconstruction or resistance? And there is this hope that, you know, Zoe sees communist posters up saying free education for all. And she's an educationist. She was a teacher before the war. She wants to put her hope into that. And so she will work to make the best of it. But ultimately, of course, it becomes clear that's not going anywhere.
Well, that's, I think, one of the really heartbreaking bits of the story is that you know, the Home
there are
Army...
lots of laughs in this book as well.
Yeah. No, there are. But so the Home Army sort of, a lot of them, I mean, there are some who carry on resisting, but a lot of them do what you're saying. They kind of try and make peace with the new regime because really they feel like they haven't got any options. And you know, we talked at the beginning about the 16, but they're only part of it. You know, and we talked about Hitler wreaking vengeance. I mean, what happens next feels like vengeance to me because, you know, as the Red Army are coming through Poland, they're initially helped by local resistance units. And then as soon as they've achieved whatever it is that they wanted to do, the Red Army just turn on them and wipe them out.
Yeah, they know who they are.
And they know who they are.
And then they take them in. Or they just kill them.
Exactly. What I find really shocking and what your book really brings home because of what happens to Zoe is how long this process lasts, right? So it's not just like 45, 46, mopping up resistance, whatever. They are still going after people as traitors who fought against the Nazis for years after the end of the war. I mean, talk us through
just the
that.
way that you said that, as traitors who fought against the Nazis. Hang on a minute. You're on the same side. You're all fighting against the Nazis. It is extraordinary. And the figures are extraordinary. So I think by the end of the Second World War, around 60,000 members of the Polish resistance called the Home Army, the AK, had been arrested. Of about 50,000 or so were then deported to Soviet prisons or prison camps to be used for their labour. And then it keeps going. It's not, as you say, it's this whole post-war period. People, there are still huge roundups, people lured to meetings. The 16 are the most famous, this sort of totem, if you like. But they did an amnesty in 1947, and they thought maybe 10, 15,000 people might hand in their arms and so on. But actually, by then, 53,000 people came forward. They're like, okay, let's draw an end to this. Let's work together. Most of whom were arrested. I mean, it just didn't end. Their prisons at the expense of it, the loss of human resources for people who wanted to help rebuild their country. One very famous fighter, Casimir Lesky, he was given an award for his brilliant work as a dock worker in engineering the same day that he was arrested. I mean, none of it makes any sense. And around 600,000 death sentences were issued in the post-war period, most of which were carried out. A number of people just disappeared, and it was never reported what happened to them. No bodies are ever returned anywhere. At one point, I think at the high point, it was 1 in 3 adult Poles were on a suspect list to be under surveillance. I mean,
and this.
If you are governing the nation and you suspect 1 in a third of the population, God, wouldn't any political party in this country be delighted to have a third of the population supporting them? And they're fighting against them. It's extraordinary. So, it's going through the 50s. I think that the last arrest, the last execution was in 1963. Or the last known one, I should say.
And this is all like the kind of Polish communist secret police, but it's very influenced by and advised by what becomes the KGB. I mean, they're right there. They're consultants,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work is directly done by them, of course, yeah.
And then Zoe herself?
Yeah, so she ends the war. She fought until the end. Then she does sort of flirt with continuing resistance, but pretty early on she makes the decision to put all of her energies into reconstruction. And she does that for some years, but she sees her friends all in turn being arrested. So Emilia Malesa, who we mentioned earlier, was the first. She was arrested in 1945. And her will was eventually broken, unfortunately. But she sees all of her other friends eventually being taken. And I mean, this is one of the great ironies of Zoe's story, is that she is so close to being caught by the Germans throughout the war. And she always manages to get away. She leaps from a train. She smudges her fingerprint on a document. They're tiny little moments that she gets by. She's never caught by the Germans. And then in 1951, she is arrested by the Polish communist regime and put through a series of trials. And she's eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison, although the way they add the maths up it actually makes 8 years, not 10, but they just sort of seem to make it 10 years on trumped up charges, really. So she had been invited by an intermediary to a meeting with a senior member of the resistance against the communists who himself has been arrested. And he admitted that she came to the meeting, but she came to the meeting and she said, no, I am spent on resistance. I'm now focused on reconstruction. But the fact that she went to the meeting was considered enough. That and they said they'd found a $10 note in her apartment. And at that point, it was illegal to have foreign currency. I mean, that was enough for 10 years. And they tortured her in prison, but she never spoke. She didn't give anything away. And one of the most amazing interviews out of many incredible interviews I did, I was so lucky, was I interviewed a woman who shared her prison cell in the communist era.
That's amazing.
It was just extraordinary. And she kept fighting in prison, as in she fought, because a lot of these, the woman I interviewed was younger than Zoe, hence still being alive, but she's passed away now, sadly. But she was a schoolgirl. She was a teenager when she was arrested. And she said a lot of these girls were killing themselves. They were drinking whatever they could or, refusing to eat. And Zoe gave them a sense of self-respect again. She gave them that. And then she also taught them she taught them maths. She taught them writing and literature. So she gave them this sort of sense of value to keep themselves going. And they continued her work after she left prison because it proved so useful. So she's absolutely an extraordinary figure. And then she gets out. They arrest her again in 1976. They kept her under surveillance. And she does. Eventually, they ruin her career. And she has to retire. She has a small heart attack. She after that cannot get work again under the regime. And so they actually gave her the greatest gift. They gave her time on her hands. So she devotes the rest of her life to collecting the narratives, the testimonies of other women and men who had fought in the war, because she realized that the story of the war being put out by the communists is one of rescue and liberation by the Red Army. This is a completely different narrative. And it's again about restoring a sense of pride to her compatriots. And so she very secretly collects all these testimonies. And she's an academic, so she does it quite thoroughly. It's pretty impressive. You can see all of it still. Very difficult handwriting, unfortunately, but it's incredible stuff. And they arrest her again in 76. And they try to arrest her again later on in life, but she manages to swerve them. and she plays a role against martial law when it's brought in, and she supports solidarity. And actually, I managed to interview President Lech Wałęsa as well. He was Poland's first democratically elected president, and afterwards he wanted to honour her, among others, and he gave her the Order of the White Eagle, which is Poland's highest award. But he said she wasn't actually that bothered about that. I think she'd got a lot of badges by then. And then he realised what she'd really appreciate, and he promoted her from sort of honorary captain to brigadier general, brackets retired. So she's only the second woman in Polish history to be made a general. And that was recognition. That really meant something to her.
It's amazing. It's such an incredible story, Claire. I mean, I can't, and your book is such an incredible testament to her. I mean, I can imagine. I'm actually getting quite emotional thinking about her life and how amazing she was. And then to get honoured like that at the end is incredible.
It is wonderful. Most of the women I've written about, it's my fifth book. My daughters are always laughing because they're always women without children. And they're going, if you write another book about a woman without children, well, no, you don't love me. Anyhow, my next book, which I've just started, is another woman without children. But anyhow, but most of them die young. And Zoe didn't, just 2 weeks shy of her centenary. So she's at the heart of this century of extraordinary history. And then ultimately it's a story of Poland getting its freedom and her getting recognition. Not that she was particularly bothered by the recognition, but it is a story of redemption and liberation. It's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've concentrated, obviously, because those are the sexy bits, on the bleak bits. But I mean, there is so much that's inspiring and beautiful in this book. So I urge people to run out and buy it. And Claire, thank you so much for coming on the History Book Buffs to talk about it.
That's a real pleasure. Lovely talking with you, Antonia. Thank you.